So, thanks, John, for inviting me down to your offices here at Compass Box headquarters. We're going to talk in a little while about some special new expressions that you're bringing out shortly. But before we get onto that, I'd like to talk a bit about Great King Street, which has been a huge success, I think, and was released earlier this year. So it's a blended Scotch whisky.
Yes.
And do you want to tell us a little bit about why you brought it out and what that all means?
Sure. Great King Street. It's a new line for us. It's a new brand, and it is dedicated to one type of Scotch whisky. It is dedicated to blended Scotch whisky. It's not vatted malt. It's not grain whisky, 100% grain whisky like hedonism. It's blended Scotch whisky. We call it Artist's Blend. This is the first release under the Great King Street label, and I like to say that this is blended Scotch whisky for malt whisky geeks.
And I guess we should taste it, actually. Yeah. Now, I think it'd be fair to say that for anyone who's familiar with Compass Box whiskies, it's got some Compass Box DNA in here. It's definitely a departure for you guys, but you know the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, and that there are notes in there that people are going to recognise from your other whiskies.
Well, one of the things that sets apart all our whiskies, whether they're Compass Box, whether it's Great King Street or whatever, is we tend to use more active oak casks. So you get more richness, more sweetness, more complexity into the whiskies due to that. So you've got the oak adding flavour, you've got the oak interacting with the spirit to create more complexity. And this is very much in that style. So this is blended Scotch whisky, so grain whisky and malt whisky. Unusually high percentage of malt whisky compared to most blends today. Most blends today usually tend to have 30–40% malt. This is 50, which is more traditional if you go back 75 years or more in blended Scotch. It is all the whiskies in it, especially the grain whiskies, it's important to point out, were aged in what we call first fill American oak. Okay, that's casks that started in America and have only been used one time here. So more richness from that. And it's also got some new oak aging, some new oak finishing. About 30% of the whiskey's been racked into new French oak for a period of time. No blend has ever done that before. And unusual for Compass Box or for whiskies from our company, about 10% of the whiskies in here have been aged in sherry casks.
And obviously you're a fan of very good quality grain whisky, and that's definitely a component.
Absolutely. You cannot make great blended Scotch whisky without great grain whisky, regardless of the percentage it might be in the recipe. And this is what a lot of people don't understand. Many people think that grain whiskies and blends are just cheap filler. Well, for the cheap blends, for the boring blends, that's fair. That's a fair accusation. For good quality blended whiskies, good quality grain whiskey creates this lovely, almost like a silk robe that wraps around the malts. It flatters the malts, and it makes the blended Scotch whisky a more versatile, more approachable, more appealing style to more people.
I mean, on the nose there as well, I mean, it's got all those kind of spicy notes that I kind of associate with some of your whiskies like Oak Cross and Spice Tree, but there's also kind of almost like a melony, sort of very fresh, fruity edge to it as well, isn't there?
Yeah, you've got fruit in there, you've got spice and toast, as you say. It's the oak and the spirit interacting, you know, the fruity character, part of it distillery character from some of the whiskies we've used, part of it fruity character that has developed between the spirit and the wood over time. Slightly higher strength than most blends, 43%.
Great mouthfeel as well.
Fat, sweet mouthfeel from not chill filtering. You know, there are very few blends. I don't know of any other blends in the world, except Asylum from our Compass Box range, that do not chill filter. So not chill filtered, so we're not removing the natural oils from the malt, so you keep that fatness on the palate. And more active oak, again, giving that fat, sweet impression on the palate.
And it's, yeah, that's it. And as you say, this is a real malt drinker's blend. And obviously an opportunity for people that maybe don't normally drink blends to reassess that position.
That's what this is. Great King Street is more than just a new line for us, a new brand. Great King Street is a mission, okay, if you'll grant me that. Great King Street is a mission to get people who love great whiskey to reconsider the joys of this style, to consider the joys of great blended Scotch whiskey. On its own, a lot to reward you with, but it's also more versatile in style and more appropriate for things like drinking it with ice, drinking it with water, drinking it with soda water as a highball. It just kind of gives a whiskey lover it expands the ways in which they can enjoy their favorite drink.
Yeah, and if I've got one axe to grind with it, it's the 50 centilitre bottle, because you finish it a bit too quickly. Because this really is, I mean, it's. I've had the pleasure of having a bottle in the house, and it very quickly became a kind of daily dram, probably shouldn't say, but it's very drinkable.
Yeah, I'm quite embarrassed as well with how many bottles I'm putting in my recycling every month.
So are there plans
50 centiliter in Europe and out into parts of Asia, 75 centiliter in North America.
Any plans to release a 70 centilitre in the UK or Europe?
Possibly in the future, yeah, in the future. You know, as more people like you adopt it as a daily dram, then yeah, we'll
But in the meantime, we'll just have to buy 2 bottles of it.
exactly.
So next, what I'd like to talk about are these 2 limited edition expressions that you're about to bring out. Now, these are being bottled and released, bottled on the 22nd of November this year, 2011, which is a very significant date, and we'll come on to the reason for that in a moment. In fact, why don't we come on to that now? Tell us what's happening on the 22nd.
On the 22nd, what's happening? Well, it goes back to 2009 when the Scotch whisky regulations, the 2009, were voted into law by UK Parliament. And this is a wide-ranging law that helps to codify the way Scotch whisky is not just made, but also labeled, sold, marketed throughout the world. One of the things that it addresses is labeling of Scotch whisky in terms of the categories of Scotch whisky. Up until this law went into effect, there were no legally binding categories for Scotch whisky labeling. There was a lot of freedom in terms of how people labeled things, and a lot of things that were inconsistent. So this law codifies those things. In particular, what it does is it lays out the 5 categories of Scotch whisky: single malt whisky, single malt Scotch whisky, single grain Scotch whisky, blended Scotch whisky, being a blend of those 2 types, grain and malt whisky. What's traditionally been called vatted malt, or in some cases pure malt, will now be known as blended malt Scotch whisky. Right. And what has traditionally been known as vatted grain whisky will be known as blended grain Scotch whisky. It lays out those 5 categories and says that all Scotch whisky producers have to label their products prominently with those 5 category descriptions.
So that brings us on nicely to these 2 expressions you're going to release and bottle on that date.
We are. On the 22nd, we will, in honor of the tradition of making vatted malt whiskies, we're going to bottle something called the last vatted malt. Right. We will also bottle the last vatted grain. Sort of a valedictory farewell to this terminology, this traditional terminology. But above all, it's about pointing out to people that the laws are changing, and that Scotch whisky will be labeled differently from there on. And so for us, it's a way to get people to pay attention, and it's a way to educate people about the new legislation, the new laws, the new labeling.
Because obviously, I mean, in principle, I think everyone would support, good regulation, and it's important for consumers to be well informed, and everyone's going to be in favour of that. I think there is a danger here, isn't there, with vatted malt is quite a distinct name from blended Scotch whisky. Now all of a sudden we're going to have blended malt Scotch whisky, which sounds very much like blended Scotch whisky. So I think there is, would you agree, potential for a bit of confusion amongst consumers over this?
Yes, I believe there is the potential for confusion, which is why we are trying to do this, start an educational effort. If you look at our Facebook page, we've got a lot on this, trying to call to people's attention and explain what the new categories are and what the definitions are. Yeah, there's the risk. Blended Scotch whisky is malt whisky and grain whisky combined. 1 or more single malts with 1 or more single grain whiskies. And that's been traditionally used for a long time. And most Scotch whisky enthusiasts know what that means. Maybe not the general public, but most enthusiasts. Yeah, blended malt Scotch whisky is quite close to blended Scotch whisky. And blended malt whisky will be just 100% malt whiskies, 1 or more single malts. So quite close, and therefore the need for education. Get the word out.
To some people, the term blended whisky maybe is seen as inferior, and correctly, I should add, to single malt.
Correctly, did you say?
Incorrectly.
Incorrectly. Thank you.
No. No, obviously not. But I think there's a danger as well that blended malts now are going to be, from the sort of more casual consumer who doesn't understand the categorization, it may actually devalue that category a little bit for them.
That is the risk, and that is something that a company like ours has to address.
Yeah.
And that's why we're starting this education effort at this point. At the end of the day, it is my belief, looking forward, that it is the reputation of the companies, of the whiskey producers, it is the reputations of the brands that will win the day in the end. And we will be able to change with time through great brands making great blended malt whiskies, making great blended Scotch whiskies. We will be able to change the way people think about these categories.
Okay, well, thanks very much for sparing a bit of time to talk to me today, and best of luck with the two new the expressions. I think you were planning a bit of a launch event for those, which I think we might pop down to.
Filling them at 11:59:59.
And that's happening where?
Well, we're going to bottle the last ones here in London because the regulations don't prohibit the bottling of vatted malts or blended scotches outside of Scotland. They do prohibit it from now on for single malts. We'll be doing it here in London under the dim light of Big Ben at 11:59:59.
All right, so that'll be something to
up until 11:59:59.
Okay, well, we'll look out for that. Might even bring a camera down to have a look at that. And best of luck with Great King Street. I think that's deservedly going to be a huge success. Well, it already is. And yeah, see you soon.
Okay, thanks, Pierre.
$50 seconds.